General U.S. Grant, hero of the Civil War, defeater of Robert E. Lee, President of the United States, forced to resign for the Army for being an alcoholic, failed farmer, tax collector, broke, penniless, homeless. Is this the General Grant that everyone knows about? The only thing Grant was known for was failing. Desolate and a vagrant, Grant makes his way in 1859 to Galena, Illinois, to work under the charity of his older brother. 5 short years later, Grant will be celebrating his victory over Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. How could someone go from rags to riches, obscurity to stardom? What happened those 3 short years to Grant in Galena? Jesse Grant had always wanted his son Ulysses S. Grant to go far in life. Once Jesse Grant found out that there was an opening at West Point, he immediately tried to get a congressman's signature so that Ulysses would get a free education at the top military academy.
Well, his father had found out there was an opening there at West Point for that congressional district, so actually it was a free education. So he applied for it to the congressman and received the appointment for his son. And so U.S. Grant went there and he attended West Point from 1839 to 1843.
When Grant was a young man, he was still not sure about what he wanted to do with his life until he went to West Point, and then graduated West Point as a second lieutenant. He had a successful start with his military career.
Well, he thought it was an unjust war of a stronger nation against a much weaker nation, but he did very well in the war. He won several merits for his bravery in battle, and he had met what would be his future wife, Julia Dent, and their engagement and marriage was actually postponed because of the Mexican War.
During the Mexican War, Grant had a lot of different experiences, including meeting his future wife. He also had a great learning experience with Winfield Scott, who showed him how to abandon supply lines and live off the land so he could move his troops faster.
After the Mexican War, he was stationed at several military posts, like in Detroit, Michigan, Sackett's Harbor, New York, and eventually went out to the West Coast. And he was unable to have his family join him because he had his wife and what would be 2 children. And just due to the hazards of having them go from Missouri to California, it was a very hazardous situation. He eventually just resigned from the Army. You know, there are stories that he was forced out, but even John Simon, who was the executive director of the U.S. Grant Association, could never find any documentation. He was really forced out.
After the war, Grant's life basically went downhill. He did not know what to do with his life to get it back on track. Throughout the many careers Grant obtained, selling real estate was one of the numerous jobs which did not work out for him. The military was surely the best thing that happened to him. His time in the Mexican War surely showed that.
Well, my first appointment was of the Illinois 21st Regiment. Well, through Governor Yates, our nickname was Yates's Hellions. Well, from there we left Cairo, and our first encounter was at Fort Henry, along with the flagship with Naval Flagship Officer Andrew Foote. We would take in Fort Henry. From there, we were on to Shiloh. Shiloh ended up being a siege, and under that, there was an unconditional surrender.
At the beginning of the Civil War, Grant was still working with his father at the leather shop. Once Grant had heard about the war, he helped organize a meeting to help recruit volunteers. He was put in charge of the 21st Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment. They were then transferred to Missouri, and Grant was promoted by President Lincoln to Brigadier General, again with the help of Elijah Washburn.
We were a part of the Illinois 45th, and the regiment that came from Galena was what they called the Lead Mine Regiment, and they actually became part of the Illinois 45th.
He trained all the recruits and tried to get a field command in the Army, but he was rejected. With the help of Illinois Congressman Elijah Washburn, Grant was promoted to colonel on June 14, 1861. Grant decided to take the matters into his own hands. Grant told his men that they were going to attack Belmont. Grant's regiment ended up winning the battle, and when his superiors asked him why he did it, he told them he did it because he was simply bored.
Why was I promoted to Lieutenant General? Well, upon the battle at Fort Donelson, I was already a Brigadier General. That is a 1-star general. After Fort Donelson, I was promoted to a 2-star general. That is a lieutenant or major general's position. And then after Vicksburg, I was promoted to a lieutenant general's position, and the very first one to hold that rank after George Washington. Well, with the Vicksburg campaign, after Vicksburg was taken, it was about a year campaign, and then we got to a point where there was about a 47-day siege on Vicksburg. From there, the Mississippi was unvexed to the sea. We had cut the South in half.
President Lincoln decided that Grant would be a great addition to the Army because none of the other generals were doing anything to contribute to the war. During the winter of 1862, Grant had two more major victories. The first was at Fort Henry. Grant brought 15,000 men along with him on gunboats that fired directly into the fort. It didn't take long for them to surrender. The next battle at Fort Donelson was not as easy of a battle. They knew Grant was coming, so they were able to prepare and were almost able to match Grant's army with the leftover men from Fort Henry. Also, with the fort being on a high bluff, gunships shot over the fort. After most ships were sunk or damaged, Grant decided to instead call for a siege.
Capture of Fort Donelson in Tennessee, and he had actually captured the whole Confederate Army. That was the first, probably major northern victory in the war. So it really made him a very, very famous general, and his name was Ulysses S. U.S. Grant, and a lot of people, with the surrender of the Confederate Army, an unconditional surrender, they kind of tagged that onto his name, unconditional surrender, Grant.
The Battle of Shiloh was one of Grant's major battles. At the beginning of the battle, Grant had to retreat and regroup with their reinforcements. Once they did that, they landed a counterattack along with the entire Confederate line, and the Confederates were forced to retreat. The battle was one of the bloodiest battles in the U.S. During the summer of 1863, there were two major assaults on the city of Vicksburg. Grant's forces suffered heavy losses on both attempts, so Grant decided to besiege the town on May 25th. The Confederates began running out of food and supplies after 40 days, so they had to finally surrender on July 4th. This battle is considered one of the turning points of the war.
So his climb actually militarily was very slow. He became a colonel and then brigadier general, slowly worked his way up to lieutenant general. But his accomplishments, during the war he captured 3 Confederate armies.
After Grant had won some major battles, he was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac and was also promoted to lieutenant general. Grant cut off Robert E. Lee at the Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee was trying to regroup with the rest of the Confederate forces. Lee launched an attack to break through the Union lines, assuming they consisted entirely of cavalry. But when he realized the cavalry was backed by 2 corps of infantry, he had no choice but to surrender.
The way I view it, U.S. Grant and the Union Army helped save our Union of States, and that was a very important thing. I don't think our country would have achieved the greatness that it did, divided with the northern and southern states. So I think he was a very important part of our history. And to think that he walked the streets of Galena, and if you walk the streets of Galena, you see a lot of the old buildings, probably the same buildings that he saw in his time. So that kind of gives it a unique perspective.
Grant had a promising start with his military career. Between going to West Point and serving in the Mexican War, after the Mexican War he moved to Galena to try to get his life back on track. Opportunity struck when the Civil War started and Galena needed to form a regiment. He then proved that he was the man for the job by being our best general in the Civil War. After the Civil War, Grant wanted to come back to Galena, which he would have if he wasn't elected President of the United States.